Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We're so delighted and honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Traci Todd. She is here to celebrate a beautiful new picture book. It's called Nina, a story about Nina Simone. Hey, Traci, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on too. Now, the Nina that we're talking about, I was going to say it's not about a cute little girl, but actually, I guess it kind of is. At least it starts that way, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Can you tell us,
Nina Simone.
Yeah, Nina Simone. Tell us a little bit about this book, please.
Sure. So this is a picture book biography of Nina Simone. And of course, that's her stage name. She starts out as Eunice Wayman. And it tells the story of her growing up in Tryon, North Carolina, and her sort of blossoming into activism as an adult. So it talks about her racial trauma and all of the things that she sort of went through as a child, in addition to her sort of musical genius that was cultivated and honed by various people. She learned from her dad. She learned from her mother, who took her to church. Her mother was a preacher. She took classical piano lessons with a sort of local piano teacher named Miss Mazzy. And she went on to Juilliard, and she just accomplished amazing things. But right around the time when she was accomplishing all of her goals as a classical pianist, the civil rights movement was very much in full swing, and she was influenced by her friends, Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin, to become active in the movement. And so the book really sort of climaxes with her activism.
Yeah. A question that pops out right away. You talked about, some of the struggles and pain that Nina went through. This is a picture book. Why do you think it's important for young kids, the typical audience of picture books, to know about these painful moments?
Well, first of all, I think that picture books can be for any audience. I think that, obviously we are traditionally thinking of picture books as for young children, but I think older children can come to picture books too. Secondly, I think that this is the truth, and young children can handle the truth, especially if they are being told the truth or read the truth by a loving adult, so that they can help put everything into context. But I think Nina's is a story that deserves to be told. And mine is not the first picture book about her, although it is the first picture book that sort of focuses on this narrative arc. I think that children deserve to know hard truths. And I think that if they know these things, if they know the truth, they can do better in the future. I think we do them a disservice if we don't tell them what really happened, and if we don't sort of portray things as they really were. And I think young children are ready to hear some of that truth.
I agree with you, and I love that. I love the statement that you made. Young children can handle the truth, especially when it's being told to them by a trusted, loving adult. Can you expand on that just a little bit? Because I think it's important, and it reinforces something that we've been talking about here on the podcast for a long time.
Well, I think that if a child is experiencing this kind of story without any context or in a vacuum, they're going to have questions, and it is going to be helpful for an adult to answer those questions or to say, hey, let's look that up if they don't have the answer. I think that when we have conversations about whether or not children can handle, conversations about racism, can handle conversations about gender and all the other things that are very much being discussed right now, I think we the resistance to it seems to be in the thinking that a child will just sort of sit with this and not have any sort of guidance, not have any sort of resolution, not have any help sort of moving through it, that it is happening or the child is experiencing it in a vacuum and not as part of a conversation, which I think is really important. And I think that, especially in families where there is a tradition of reading out loud and, of reading picture books, I think that having that conversation about race, about gender, about whatever it is, builds a trust, builds on the trust of that relationship with that adult. So I think it's important. And I think we need more books out there that are honest about this. And also I felt like I couldn't tell Nina's story without talking about race and racism. And I couldn't, at the time when I first started writing this book, which feels like 100 years ago now, there were many picture books for young children that sort of talked about racism and talked about discrimination in terms that suggested, that's just the way it was. It was, Black people were just mistreated, and sort of didn't ground it in anything that was actually happening or any sort of reality. And, I couldn't. Nina Simone was so specific in her messaging, was so clear in her intent that I couldn't just sort of put it out there without sort of building to it, without building a structure, without building scaffolding, so you could see how she got there. I mean, she deserves her whole story to be told, I felt.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that struggle that she experienced, please.
Yeah, so it's messy, right? Because we're all human beings are messy. But she grew up in the South, but in a town that wasn't really sort of affected by Jim Crow in the way that we're accustomed, to cities in the South being affected by Jim Crow. There were Black people and white people sort of, intermixed and what have you, although there definitely was sort of a Black side of town and a white side of town. But, there's this sort of warmth and loving environment that she grows up in with her father and her mother and her brothers and sisters. And then when she sort of gets outside of that, that's when she experiences this stuff that she doesn't understand with white people, where they don't seem to want her around. Her mother works as a housekeeper for Mrs. Miller, who has a small child who's about Eunice's age at that time. And they're playmates. They play together at Mrs. Miller's house. And sometimes when Mrs. Miller drives Nina's mother home, David will come over and they will play together then. And then all of a sudden, Mrs. Miller decides that her child can no longer play with a Black girl. And it's just sort of arbitrary, and it feels it's coming out of nowhere. So it's really abrupt when I talk about it in the picture book, that separation. But it's something that, happened again and again. James Baldwin talks about it, and Toni Morrison talks about it, this sort of separation. And it's this moment for a lot of Black children when they realize for the first time that what it means to be Black, or that there is something about them that is separate. And, that was one of the key moments. And then there was another moment when Nina was like 10 or 11, I think, and she gave a recital at the library, her hometown library, and her parents were sitting in the front row so she could watch her fingers play the piano. And then they were asked to move to a back row seat so that a white couple could sit. And, this is all happening while Nina's on stage. She's about to start playing and she doesn't know what's going on. And all she knows is that her parents are being removed, and she just sits there and doesn't play until her parents are brought back. It's hard to imagine what she was actually feeling in that moment. I mean, there must have been so much fear and confusion, and she probably didn't entirely connect it to race because, who knows what her conversations about race had been up until that point. But these are things, the moment with Mrs. Miller's son, the moment at the recital, these are things that she held on to. and that sort of she carried with her into adulthood, so that when she became an activist, when she was involved in the civil rights movement, this was part of what informed her activism. So it didn't just happen because Black people were marching in the streets in the 60s and the 50s. It happened because of her own personal narrative as well.
I'm imagining that would be a very powerful moment for a family to experience together as they're reading Nina and getting to that point. And I can just imagine my own son or daughter looking up to me and saying, why can't they play together anymore? I don't understand that.
Yeah.
And I would be at a loss to say, I don't know either. But that willingness for the parent to kind of admit, I don't know. Let's talk about it some more. That's something that we've been encouraging families to do since we started the show. I believe that being up on that pedestal that our kids put us on, that we know everything, it's a really hard place to stay. And I think admitting to our kids that we don't know why something like racism exists is the start of hopefully the solution of working together to, at least if we can't eliminate it in the world, we can do our best to eliminate it within our family and in ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, and, the truth is you can figure out why racism exists. You can go back and do that study, and it's not an easy study. And, there are answers to those questions. They're just hard answers, and they require a reordering of thinking in a lot of ways, especially in this country. And I actually, I started out when I answered your question previously by saying that people are messy and all of this was messy. One of the things that was also important to me to do was to talk about Mrs. Miller in this moment where her son and Eunice were separated, but also show how helpful Mrs. Miller was in furthering Nina's career. I mean, she introduced Nina to Ms. Mazzy, who became the piano teacher and who was sort of a lifelong mentor and friend. So there were many dimensions to Nina's relationship to whiteness, especially when she was a child, and certainly too as an adult.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is so stupid. These feelings and hatreds and prejudices that we've been suffering with. Certainly, Black people have been suffering, but I think we've all, as a nation, have been suffering from this because it's prevented lots of folks from having deep, meaningful relationships with people that they would have loved otherwise if those barriers, those prejudices didn't exist. I wish I was more articulate about this. This has been an issue that's been, part of my life for all of my life. I've been called not racial epithets, but racial epithet lovers throughout my, and just didn't understand it, and I still don't understand it. And I guess I don't wish to understand the hate. I do wish to figure out a way for us to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to believe that it's something as simple as hate, right? It's just, it's something that has been ingrained in us and inculcated. And that, I think the conversations right now about, on the right about, critical race theory being indoctrination and all this stuff. And I go, but history all along has been sort of an indoctrination of something that's not entirely true. The story of this country and what gets left out and whose story is told and who is centered and who is the hero. That the lack of truth in the stories that we tell ourselves about this country is a form of indoctrination. And when I was a kid, we said the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. So like talk about the indoctrination. I think it is, I think when we just say, there's hatred and prejudice, and how do we get beyond it without actually understanding the structures that support it and understanding, the root of it. We're not going to get it. We're not going to sort of knock it down because it doesn't exist sort of up here on this level in the ether. It is down in the dirt of this nation. It is something, it is in the Constitution. It is in the Declaration of Independence. It is in the people that we consider the founding fathers. And when you look at the things that they wrote, it is in the writings of Lincoln, people we uphold as, as sort of racial heroes in some ways. It's just a matter, I think, of unlearning. It's not just, it's a really hard thing to do, but unlearning all of these stories that we've been told and taught and that we accept. I think if we could start somewhere like saying that the Constitution is an extraordinary document and also deeply racist, if we can hold space for both of those things to be possible, then we might be able to have some of these conversations that we need to have. And not just the Constitution, I'm just using that as one example. But, I think we are not able to hold space for more than one thing to be true about the things that we hold dear. And I think we can't, how do we talk about America as exceptional and not acknowledge that it was built on the backs of enslaved people and indigenous people? I don't know. I
don't know either. And I think if I live another 100 years, I hope I would know. But I think you bring up a really good point, because I think part of the the polarization that's happening in our country is that people aren't able to say, yeah, but. It's like as you said, the Constitution.
Or yes and.
Yes and, yeah. The Constitution is this amazing thing, but there's some problems with it too.
Yeah.
And our country has done some amazing things, but we've done some really horrible things too. And not just to people in Black and Indigenous people here in our country, but we've done some horrible things in different parts of the world, if not our nation, the government directly supporting different corporations. And the best way to move forward is to own up to that. Mm-hmm. Like we tell our kids. I remember saying to my son, dude, just be honest with me. We can move on from this,
Yeah,
I got you red-handed.
It's the moving forward, right? It's not, you don't have to sit in the trauma. You don't have to sit in the pain. You have to acknowledge the truth. You have to acknowledge the trauma and then move forward, which is why, even though I know that Nina is a really difficult book on some level, especially for a young child, I ended it with hope. Mm-hmm. There is a future. It is future looking. It is moving forward. So I think, we have to acknowledge those truths, but I think things are working exactly the way they're supposed to work. Like we are supposed to, sort of the structures of things are set up such that if they are challenged in any way, they have to be defended. Mm-hmm. They have to be, otherwise, the walls might come tumbling down, and where would we be? So, I don't know. There's a defense mechanism that has been put up that is so invisible that it's hard to question.
It is, but it's important for us to question.
Absolutely.
And I can't believe we've been talking almost 20 minutes here about Nina and about her life and her struggles, and we haven't acknowledged the fact that she was an incredible artist.
Yeah, she was.
So talk a little bit about her music and her artistry, please.
Yes, I wish that I had the musical acumen to really sort of delve into the intricacies of all the things that she was doing. People who have that kind of ear can hear, all of her various influences. But she learned to play the piano on her father's knee. He was an entertainer who sort of, played sort of ragtime and what have you, and could only play the black keys. And people who know music know about the pentatonic scale and what that means and all those things. But that's sort of the blues scale, and that's the scale that you hear in blues music. So I always feel a little strange when people talk about Nina as a jazz musician, because really any of the music that was a departure from her church music and her classical music felt like blues to me. So that came from her father. He would sit her on his knee, and they'd play the piano, and eventually she could play on her own, and her father would sit out on the porch and sort of listen to her play. Her mother, as I mentioned, was a preacher and was very religious, and so thought that, jazz and blues and all of this was the devil's music. And so, Dad was sort of lookout on the porch, and when Mom was coming, he would signal to Nina to switch, and she could switch. She could move from that jazz, blues, dance music into church music without missing a note. She just had that ear. She could do it. And that was part of her musical influence, those two things. So I think when she was 3, her mother took her with her on these church circuits where her mother would preach and Nina would play. And so she had this jazz music from her dad, sort of bluesy music, dance music from her dad, and the church music from her mother. And then she, I said her mother worked for this woman named Mrs. Miller, and she would tell Mrs. Miller about how incredibly talented her daughter was. And then Mrs. Miller was like, well, we should do something about this talent, and introduced her to Ms. Mazzy, who taught Nina to play classical music. And Nina loved Bach most of all. That music was so complicated, and it had all these crescendos and, what have you. So she had her father's music, her mother's music, and classical music. Those were the influences that she sort of came together when she was an adult. But as a young person, she really wanted to be a classical pianist. So she went to Juilliard, and then she applied to the Curtis School of Music in Philadelphia, and she was not admitted, and it was sort of devastating for her. She heard that it was because she was Black, and that was, yet another thing. It just sort of recalled all of these traumas from her childhood, and she thought that was the end of music for her. But she became a piano teacher, and her piano students told her about these bars in Atlantic City that would hire pianists to play into the wee small hours. And she took one of those jobs, and then she brought all of her influences together, the church, the jazz, the classical music in these bars. And she sort of honed her talents, and she could do whatever she wanted as long as she sang. And she gained a following in New York as well as Philadelphia and New Jersey. And, she just became sort of the toast of Greenwich Village and all of these places back then. And that's how she became friends with people like Lorraine Hansberry and James Baldwin, who were in her ear about activism, which she was not ready for right away. Mm-hmm. And, she had this is like an incredible detail that I couldn't believe, a coincidence that I couldn't believe that, came to be. But her first performance at Carnegie Hall was the same night that King was arrested, or during the same time that he was arrested and in Birmingham and sitting in the Birmingham jail. Wow. And so I was able to create a contrast to, like, finally Nina had reached this sort of dream state, this dream status, playing at Carnegie Hall, playing, I think it was 18 songs or what have you, before a huge audience, a sold out crowd. And at the same time, King was sitting in Birmingham jail. Mm. And that's when I was able to sort of make the shift in the book to her activism and her awareness of what was going on, which she was aware of. She knew that people were marching and protesting, but she didn't really join until 1963 when Medgar Evers was assassinated, when the church bombing happened in the 16th Street church bombing in Birmingham, and the 4 girls were killed. That's really just what set her off. I don't know if I can say the name of the song, but that inspired her to write, sort of one of her most forceful civil rights anthems.
Yeah. Did Nina suffer at all because of her activism?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But she also was really aware of her audience, right? In a lot of songs, she was singing to white people on behalf of Black people. So songs like the one whose name I don't know if I can say it. But there's a line in there that you don't have to live next to me, just give me my equality. She's not talking to Black people. She's talking to white people. Backlash Blues, which was written by Langston Hughes. There's a line about white backlash, your mean old white backlash. There's a line in I Wish I Could Know How It Feels to Be Free, where she sings, I wish you could know how it feels to be me. She knew that she had an incredible white, a lot of white people enjoyed her music. And so she used that to her advantage. She also sang to Black people, obviously Young, Gifted, and Black, and many other songs. But she knew who her audience was, or a lot of her audience anyway. And so, it was quite intentional. And she wanted to carry on that fight, for a long time after 1963, which is when she wrote Mississippi. She was in lots of concerts, and there were lots of, it's incredibly joyful footage of her sort of singing before these audiences and what have you. So her career continued after that. But, it was on the decline after the civil rights legislation was passed in the 60s, and people didn't have the tolerance for activism as much anymore. And even though she knew that there was still this need, there was not the love for that kind of music. And I think that was the beginning of the decline of her career. And she had mental health concerns, so it went undiagnosed for a long time. And I think that they also started to come to the fore, or were increasingly public around this time. So there were a lot of factors that contributed to the sort of decline of her career, but I don't think her music has ever gone away. I think people have always found strength and joy in her music.
Yeah. As you're talking to me about this book, we started off talking about it being a picture book and acknowledging the fact that picture books can bring a lot to older audiences as well, and it can be very meaningful for adults. This is definitely a book that I think can touch a lot of hearts, a lot of different age groups. And I also think, we hear parents joke about, this is the 900th time I've read this book. I don't want to read about the caterpillar anymore. But I think Nina is a book that we can read as a family together and experience in a number of different ways. Having conversations about race, having conversations about resiliency, having conversations about how we can stand up for ourselves and how we can stand up for others. So many different conversations that can really make Nina a super important addition to I think, any family library.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think it works on a lot of levels. It's not a book that I imagine. I mean, I hope that kids will want to curl up with it at night, but it's not that. It doesn't feel like that kind of book to me, although I did try to tell it as if it were a story. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be pulled from it. And there's so much that's relevant today. I mean, I think it's really easy to say that this is a story that happened in the past and, good for Nina, good for everybody. But it's, when all of the racial unrest and uprising that happened in summer of 2020, when that was going on, there was so much coverage, and I heard podcasts, and there was just a lot of conversation about Nina Simone and the place that her music took in all of these conversations, and all of this sort of need for empowerment and strength. And, her music is still, and there's something quite sad about that too, actually, that her music is still as relevant as it is, her protest music in particular. It's interesting when I when people tell me, I tell them about this book, and they tell me how much they love Nina Simone. And I say, oh, what's your favorite song? And it's usually Feeling Good, or, something that is not protest music. But, I think a lot of people, especially last summer, summer 2020, just gained a lot of strength from her words and from that time. And also, I think it's, like I said, quite painful to think that we were going through a time all these years later when that music was relevant again.
Well, I know people are absolutely going to want to know where they can go to find out more about you and find out more about Nina.
Well, first, I just want to be sure to acknowledge that Christian Robinson, who is the illustrator of this book, did a fantastic, fantastic job. I mean, just sort of beyond what I could have imagined. And he took what I think is a difficult subject and made it softer and made it more accessible. And of course, he's a genius. Everyone knows that Christian Robinson's work is it's just another level. Where can you go to find more information about me? I don't know. I am not really on the internet. I don't have a public facing anything yet. I know that's probably not the way to go, but I prefer to just, I don't know. Until that becomes an issue, I'm just going to be, available through podcasts and various other methods, and my agent. People can find me through my agent if they want to. ninasimone.com is, an incredible resource. And there are lots of books about her that are written for adults. There is one other picture book that I mentioned, also called Nina. And, there's just a lot about Nina out there. And then I would encourage people, and children especially, to listen to her music. Maybe not the song that I mentioned in the book, which I have to say, I'm pretty proud of myself for being able to talk around it and not mention the name of the song. But other songs, like I wish I could know how it feels to be free. Backlash Blues. There's a song called Turning Point, which is very much about that moment when Black children and white children are separated. It is beautiful and heartbreaking. And then, of course, Feeling Good, and all of her other sort of more upbeat and commercial songs. There's plenty to be enjoyed for all ages.
Awesome. Well, we've had it. This has been a wonderful, and at some points it was a difficult conversation, but I think it was a really important conversation. And I think that Nina, A Story of Nina Simone by our guest Traci Todd, is a book that's going to inspire lots of really important conversations with families. And we're really happy we had this opportunity to spend time with our guest, Traci Todd. Hey, Traci, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. What a pleasure this was.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Salvador Gomez Colon. He'll be celebrating his really powerful book. It's called Hurricane, My Story of Resilience. You don't want to miss it. It talks all about his experience in the wake of Hurricane Maria that devastated the beautiful island of Puerto Rico. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Chris, I want to start by thanking our guest, Traci Todd. Be sure to check out Nina, a story about Nina Simone. I also want to check out Nina's music, too. Also want to thank my team, Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Michael Murphy. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.